Move. This seat isn't for people like you." The words landed sharp and clean, slicing through the quiet hum of the boardroom like a blade made of glass. And for a second, no one moved, no one breathed, because the sentence carried more than authority. It carried assumption. The leather chair at the head of the long walnut table still held the warmth of Marcus Reed's body, but Evelyn Whitmore didn't hesitate as she set her designer handbag down on the polished surface, the soft thud echoing louder than it should have in a room lined with floor-to-ceiling windows and 12 silent executives. Marcus didn't stand immediately. His fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table, the cool wood grounding him, the faint reflection of his face staring back from the glossy finish beneath the overhead lights. Outside, 30 stories below, traffic crawled along Fifth Avenue in thin, restless lines, but up here, everything had slowed to a near standstill. Evelyn tilted her head, studying him the way someone might study an unfamiliar object left in the wrong place. Her expression composed, but edged with something colder than impatience. "You heard me," she added, her voice quieter now, which somehow made it heavier, more final. A few of the board members shifted in their seats, exchanging quick glances that never quite met Marcus's eyes, their silence forming a wall more solid than any spoken agreement. Marcus rose then, not abruptly, not reluctantly, but with a measured calm that didn't match the tension tightening the air. His suit was simple, charcoal gray, perfectly fitted but without the loud signals of wealth that filled the room. No gleaming watch, no flashy cufflinks, nothing that demanded attention. And yet, as he stood, something about him held the space in a way that made the silence deepen instead of break. 12 years ago, he had stood in this same building wearing a maintenance uniform, pushing a cart that rattled softly over marble floors, invisible to the people who now avoided his gaze. Back then, the elevators had opened for everyone but him. Conversations had paused just long enough for him to pass, and doors had closed without acknowledgement. The memory flickered behind his eyes for only a second, gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the present, the weight of expectation pressing in from every corner of the room. Evelyn slid into the chair without asking again, crossing one leg over the other with practiced ease, claiming the space as if it had always been hers. "We don't have time for confusion today," she said, smoothing a non-existent crease from her sleeve, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone used to being obeyed. The assistant near the wall glanced down at her tablet, pretending to check something, while one of the senior partners cleared his throat but said nothing, the sound dissolving into the air before it could become a sentence. Marcus stepped back from the chair, giving her space, but his eyes moved slowly across the table, meeting each face in turn, not accusing, not pleading, just present, steady, as if he were memorizing something that mattered. The overhead lights cast a soft reflection across the glass panels behind them, turning the city into a muted blur of silver and blue, and for a moment, it felt like the entire room existed outside of time, suspended between what had just been said and what had yet to happen. Marcus's hand slipped into his coat pocket, not hurried, not defensive, just deliberate, and when he looked back at Evelyn, there was no anger in his expression, no trace of the humiliation her words were meant to deliver. Only something quieter, something patient, and that, more than anything, made the room feel smaller. The silence did not break when Marcus stepped away from the chair. It stretched, thin and taut, like a wire pulled too tight across the room, and in that silence, details began to surface, the quiet kind that people only noticed when they were unsure where to look next. The faint ticking of a wall clock near the glass partition, the soft hum of the air conditioning pushing cool air through hidden vents, the subtle scrape of a pen as one of the junior analysts adjusted it against a legal pad. Without writing a single word, Marcus moved with unhurried precision, circling the edge of the table until he stood near the far side, not at the head, not at the center, but somewhere in between, a place that did not belong to authority and yet did not surrender to it either. His posture remained relaxed, shoulders level, chin steady, as if the moment had not shifted anything inside him, as if he had expected this exact sequence of events long before he walked into the room. Across from him, Evelyn Whitmore had already begun organizing the space to her liking, sliding a stack of documents closer, aligning a silver pen parallel to the edge of the table, her movements efficient and practiced, each gesture reinforcing her presence, her control, her certainty that nothing in this room would challenge her version of reality. "Let us proceed," she said, her tone smooth, almost dismissive now, as though the interruption had already been resolved in her mind, as though Marcus had become just another minor inconvenience absorbed and erased. A few heads nodded, not in agreement, but in habit, conditioned responses built over years of hierarchy and expectation, and one by one, laptops opened, screens flickered to life, fingers hovered above keyboards waiting for direction that had not yet fully arrived. Marcus watched them, not with resentment, not even with disappointment, but with a quiet awareness that seemed to take in everything at once. The way the senior partner at the end of the table avoided looking at him directly, the way the assistant near the door kept glancing between Evelyn and the empty space where Marcus had been sitting moments before, the way uncertainty moved through the room like a draft no one could quite locate. He reached into his coat pocket again, slower this time, and withdrew nothing at first, just letting his hand rest there as if considering something invisible, something that did not need to be seen to exist. 12 years earlier, he had stood outside this very boardroom holding a mop handle, waiting for a meeting to end so he could clean the floors no one else thought about, listening through the closed door as voices debated decisions worth millions of dollars, decisions that shaped futures he was never meant to be part of, and he had learned then that power was rarely loud. It did not need to be. It moved quietly, signed papers, shifted ownership, rewrote outcomes long before anyone realized what had changed. That lesson had stayed with him, settled into the way he carried himself, the way he chose silence over reaction, timing over impulse. "Before we begin," he said finally, his voice even, not raised, not forced, but clear enough to cut through the soft noise of devices powering on and papers being adjusted. The room paused again, not as abruptly as before, but enough to slow the motion that had just begun to rebuild around Evelyn's command. She did not look up immediately, continuing to scan the first page of the document in front of her, as if acknowledging him too quickly would grant him more weight than she intended. "We have already begun," she replied, still reading, her tone controlled, almost bored, the kind of response that closed doors without appearing to. Marcus did not move closer, did not step forward to reclaim the seat or interrupt her physically. Instead, he let the distance remain, let the geometry of the room hold its shape, because what he was about to say did not require proximity. His gaze shifted briefly toward the large monitor mounted on the wall, currently blank except for the faint reflection of the table and the figures seated around it, then back to Evelyn, who had finally lifted her eyes just enough to acknowledge his presence without fully engaging it. There was a moment, small and nearly invisible, where something in her expression tightened, not fear, not doubt, but a subtle recognition that the man she had dismissed had not left, had not argued, had not reacted in the expected ways, and that absence of reaction created a space she could not immediately control. Marcus's hand slipped fully out of his pocket now, empty, open, his fingers relaxed at his side, and when he spoke again, the room seemed to lean toward him without anyone consciously deciding to listen. "Then it would make sense," he said, each word placed carefully, "for everyone here to understand who approved what you are about to present." The sentence did not sound like a challenge. It did not rise in tone or sharpen at the edges, but it carried something deeper, a quiet weight that settled into the center of the table, into the documents, into the unspoken assumptions that had filled the room just moments earlier. No one interrupted him this time. Even Evelyn paused, her eyes resting on him a fraction longer than before, her fingers still on the page but no longer turning it, as if the next move, whatever it was, had just shifted from routine to something else entirely. The air in the room shifted in a way that could not be seen but could be felt, like a pressure drop before a storm, subtle but undeniable, and for the first time since Evelyn Whitmore had taken the seat, the rhythm she controlled began to hesitate. Her fingers rested on the document in front of her, but she did not turn the page. The silver pen she had aligned so precisely now lay untouched, its reflection stretched thin across the polished wood surface. "Approved?" she repeated, lifting her eyes fully now, her gaze locking onto Marcus with a sharper edge, not yet threatened, but no longer dismissive either. Around the table, a few of the executives exchanged glances that lasted a fraction too long, the kind that carried questions no one wanted to ask out loud. Marcus did not respond immediately. He let the word linger in the space between them, let it settle into the silence that followed, because he understood something most people in that room had forgotten, that silence, when held long enough, could be louder than any argument. His eyes moved briefly toward the large monitor on the wall again, still blank, still reflecting only fragments of the room, the outline of Evelyn's posture, the faint silhouette of those seated around her. "Yes," he said finally, his voice steady, measured, approved. One of the senior partners cleared his throat, the sound dry, uncertain. "Mr. Reed," he began, then stopped, as if unsure whether to continue, as if even using Marcus's name required a level of acknowledgement he had not yet committed to. Evelyn leaned back slightly in the chair, her posture shifting just enough to signal control, to re-establish her presence in the center of the room. "We have a board for that," she said, her tone firmer now. Reclaiming ground, she felt slipping. "Approvals go through proper channels." Marcus inclined his head a fraction, not in agreement, not in disagreement, but in recognition of the statement itself. "They do," he replied, his words calm, almost reflective. "And sometimes those channels change before everyone notices." The sentence landed quietly, but it carried a weight that settled across the table, pressing into the documents, into the screens that now displayed spreadsheets and projections no one was actively reading. The assistant near the door glanced up again, this time holding her gaze on Marcus a second longer, as if trying to place him, as if searching for a detail she had missed. Across from her, the chief financial officer shifted in his seat, his hand hovering over his tablet before finally tapping the screen, pulling up something that had not been part of the scheduled agenda. The faint glow illuminated his face, and as his eyes scanned the data, a subtle change moved through his expression, not dramatic, not immediate, but enough to slow his breathing, enough to make him sit a little straighter. Evelyn noticed the movement. She always noticed movement. Her gaze flicked toward him, then back to Marcus, her composure still intact but now threaded with a thin line of impatience. "If you have something to say," she said, each word controlled, deliberate, "you should say it." Marcus took a step closer to the table, not toward her, but toward the center, where the documents were spread, where the weight of the meeting lived. His hand hovered briefly above the surface, then rested lightly against it, fingers splayed just enough to anchor himself without claiming space that was not yet offered. "I am saying it," he replied, his voice no louder than before, but clearer now, sharper in its precision. The chief financial officer exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding, and turned his tablet slightly toward the senior partner beside him. The two exchanged a look, brief but loaded, a silent confirmation passing between them. The senior partner's jaw tightened, his eyes lifting toward Marcus with a new kind of focus, one that replaced dismissal. With calculation, Evelyn's gaze followed the shift, moving from face to face, reading the room the way she always had, searching for alignment, for loyalty, for the invisible threads that kept her in control. But something had changed. The threads did not pull the same way. The room was no longer responding to her alone. Marcus watched it happen without interruption, without urgency, as if he had already seen this moment play out in his mind long before he walked through the door. The city outside the glass continued its distant motion, cars inching forward, people crossing streets, unaware that inside this room, something far quieter and far more significant was unfolding. Marcus straightened slightly, his hand lifting from the table, and for a brief second, the reflection beneath him showed not the man who had been asked to move, but the one who had never truly left. "Check the updated filings," he said, not directing the instruction to anyone in particular, but knowing exactly who would respond. The chief financial officer's fingers moved quickly now, pulling up a new document, scrolling, pausing, then scrolling again, his eyes narrowing as the details aligned into something undeniable. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer built on assumption. It was built on realization, still forming, still incomplete, but already too large to ignore. The chief financial officer's hand stopped mid-scroll, his thumb hovering above the glass screen, as if the next movement might confirm something he was not yet ready to say out loud. And when he finally looked up, the shift in his expression was no longer subtle. It was visible, unmistakable, the kind that traveled across a room faster than words ever could. This cannot be right, he murmured, not loudly, but enough for the sentence to reach the edges of the table, where it settled into the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Evelyn's gaze snapped toward him, sharp and immediate, her control tightening rather than slipping. "What cannot be right?" she asked, her tone crisp, demanding clarity, demanding alignment, demanding that whatever uncertainty had appeared be corrected, before it spread any further. The chief financial officer hesitated, not because he did not understand what he was seeing, but because he understood it too well, and the weight of that understanding pressed against his usual composure. He turned the tablet fully now, angling it so the senior partner beside him could see, then, after a brief pause, rotating it further so it faced the center of the table. The glow from the screen cut across the polished wood, reflecting faintly in the glass walls behind them. "The updated ownership filings," he said, his voice steadier than his expression. "They were processed late last night." A quiet ripple moved through the room, not a sound, not a movement, but a collective shift in attention, every gaze drawn toward the screen, toward the data that had suddenly become more important than any prepared presentation. Evelyn did not look at it immediately. She held Marcus's gaze instead, as if the answer she needed would come from him, not from the numbers. "Processed by whom?" she asked, each word precise, controlled, as though the structure of the question itself could contain the situation. Marcus did not rush to respond. He let the question sit, let the room absorb it, let the attention build around something that was no longer just a misunderstanding. His posture remained unchanged, steady, grounded, as if he had been standing in this exact position long before anyone else arrived. "By the same channels you mentioned," he said finally, his voice calm, unforced, carrying no edge of confrontation, only fact. The senior partner leaned closer to the screen, his eyes scanning the details more quickly now, his lips pressing into a thin line as the information aligned piece by piece. "Majority transfer," he said under his breath, almost to himself, but the words carried, landing heavier than intended. "Controlling interest, effective immediately." The assistant near the door straightened slightly, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a quiet alertness, as if she were witnessing something she would later struggle to describe but never forget. Evelyn's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against the edge of the document in front of her, the paper bending just enough to reveal the pressure beneath her otherwise composed exterior. "That is not possible," she said, her voice still controlled, but now threaded with something sharper, something that pushed against the edges of disbelief. "Transactions of that scale do not happen without notice." Marcus's eyes did not leave hers. "They do," he replied, "when the notice is not meant for everyone." The sentence did not rise in volume, but it carried a finality that settled into the center of the room, pressing into every assumption that had existed just minutes before. The chief financial officer exhaled slowly again, this time more audibly, as if releasing the last of his hesitation. "It is legitimate," he said, more firmly now, his voice steadying as he accepted what he was seeing. "All filings are verified. The transfer is complete." The words moved through the room like a current, quiet but undeniable, shifting the balance that had defined every interaction since the meeting began. One by one, the board members adjusted in their seats, not dramatically, but enough to signal awareness, enough to acknowledge that something fundamental had changed. Evelyn's gaze flickered, just for a fraction of a second, toward the tablet, then back to Marcus, as if measuring which reality to confront first, the data in front of her or the man who had brought it into the room. The city beyond the glass continued its distant rhythm, unchanged, indifferent, while inside, the air felt heavier, denser, filled with the weight of recognition that was still settling into place. Marcus took a single step forward, not to reclaim the chair, not to close the distance, but simply to stand where he could be seen without obstruction, where his presence no longer blended into the background of the room. His hands remained at his sides, relaxed, open, his expression unchanged, calm in a way that did not demand attention but held it anyway. "So before we continue," he said, his voice even, precise, "it would help if everyone here understood exactly who they are reporting to." No one spoke immediately. No one interrupted. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was waiting. No one reached for their notes anymore. No one pretended to type or scroll or prepare the next slide, because the center of gravity in the room had shifted completely, and everyone felt it, even if they had not yet said it out loud. The words Marcus had just spoken did not echo. They settled, heavy and precise, pressing into the polished table, into the documents that suddenly felt irrelevant, into the carefully constructed hierarchy that had quietly unraveled in less than a minute. Evelyn Whitmore did not move at first. She remained seated in the chair she had claimed, her posture still composed, her shoulders squared, but the stillness around her was no longer the stillness of control. It was the stillness of calculation, the kind that comes when a person realizes the rules they have relied on no longer apply in the same way. Her eyes shifted once more to the tablet in front of the chief financial officer, then back to Marcus. And for the first time, there was a pause before she spoke, a fraction of a second where certainty did not arrive on time. "If this is some kind of maneuver," she said, her voice measured, slower now, "then it is an unusual one." The sentence was carefully chosen, not an admission, not a challenge, but something in between, something that allowed her to remain standing in her authority even as the ground beneath it adjusted. Marcus did not respond immediately. He let her words exist, let them take their place in the room without pushing against them, because he understood that what mattered now was not speed, but clarity. Around the table, the board members watched the exchange with a new kind of attention, no longer passive, no longer aligned by default, but actively observing, weighing, recalibrating their positions in real time. The senior partner leaned back slightly, his earlier tension replaced by a quiet focus, his eyes moving between Evelyn and Marcus as if measuring distance that could not be seen. The chief financial officer set the tablet down carefully, the soft tap against the table sounding louder than it should have, a small but definitive gesture that signaled the end of uncertainty on his part. "It is not a maneuver," he said, his voice steady, firm now, no longer tentative. "It is a completed transfer of controlling interest." The statement carried across the room, and this time, no one questioned it. Evelyn's fingers released the edge of the document in front of her, the slight bend in the paper flattening back into place as the pressure lifted. She drew in a slow breath, subtle, controlled, the kind that resets posture without drawing attention to the need for it. "And you are suggesting," she said, turning fully toward Marcus now, her gaze direct, "that this was done without the board's awareness." Marcus met her eyes without hesitation. "I am not suggesting anything," he replied, his tone even, grounded. "I am stating that it was done." The distinction hung in the air, precise and deliberate. A few seats down, one of the board members shifted forward, elbows resting lightly on the table, his attention fully engaged now, no longer divided. Another adjusted his glasses, eyes narrowing slightly as if seeing Marcus clearly for the first time. The assistant near the door remained still, her tablet held against her chest, forgotten for the moment, her focus fixed entirely on the exchange unfolding before her. Evelyn's expression tightened, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the effort it took to maintain composure under shifting conditions. "Then you understand," she said, choosing her words carefully, "that actions of this scale raise questions." Marcus inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without conceding anything. "They do," he said, "and they also provide answers." The room absorbed that quietly, the balance continuing to shift, not abruptly, but steadily, like a scale finding its true center after being tipped for too long. Evelyn's gaze flickered once more across the table, scanning the faces that had once reflected her authority without hesitation, now reflecting something more complex, something less predictable. She saw it in the way the chief financial officer no longer looked to her before speaking, in the way the senior partner held his attention on Marcus without apology, in the way the room itself seemed to be reorienting around a new axis. She turned back to Marcus, holding his gaze, and for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller, not physically, but in terms of understanding. "Then perhaps," she said, her voice quieter now, though no less controlled. "You should clarify exactly what position you believe you hold in this room." The question was direct, unavoidable, and it settled into the silence that followed like a final step in a sequence that had been building from the moment she first spoke. Marcus did not rush to answer. He allowed the question to exist fully, to reach every corner of the room, to settle into every expectation that had been quietly rewritten. Then, with the same calm that had defined him from the beginning, he took a single breath, steady and unforced, and prepared to respond, not with emotion, not with retaliation, but with something far more definitive than either. The room did not move forward. It held itself in place, suspended between a question and the answer that had not yet been spoken. And in that stillness, every small detail seemed sharper. The faint reflection of the skyline stretching across the glass wall, the soft ticking of the clock marking seconds that felt longer than they should, the quiet weight of expectations settling into every chair, every document, every breath. Marcus Reed did not rush to fill the silence. He stood exactly where he was, neither advancing nor retreating, his posture steady, his hands relaxed at his sides, as if time itself had slowed around him and he alone was not affected by the pressure that filled the space. Evelyn Whitmore watched him closely now, no longer dismissing, no longer assuming, but studying, measuring, recalibrating in real time, her gaze sharper, her attention fully anchored in the moment she could not control as easily as the ones before it. Around the table, no one looked away. The chief financial officer remained still, his tablet now dark, set aside, no longer needed for confirmation. The senior partner leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the polished wood, his focus locked on Marcus with a clarity that had not existed minutes ago. Even the assistant near the door seemed rooted in place, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a quiet awareness that something significant was unfolding, something that would define more than just this meeting. Marcus drew in a slow breath, subtle, controlled, the kind that did not draw attention but grounded everything that followed. When he finally spoke, his voice did not rise, it did not sharpen, it simply settled into the room with a clarity that left no space for misinterpretation. "I do not believe I hold a position," he said, his words deliberate, each one placed with care. The sentence hung in the air, unexpected, not aligning with the tension that had built around it. And for a brief moment, confusion flickered across a few faces at the table. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, as if trying to understand the direction he was taking. Marcus did not pause long. He let the first part of the answer exist just long enough to be felt, then continued, his tone unchanged, steady as before. "Positions are assigned," he said. "They can be given, taken, replaced." His gaze moved slowly across the room, not lingering on any one person, but acknowledging all of them, the weight of his words settling differently on each face. "What I hold is not assigned." The distinction was quiet, but it shifted something fundamental in the room, something deeper than titles, deeper than roles, something tied to ownership, to control, to authority that did not depend on recognition to exist. Evelyn's posture adjusted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders straightening, her chin lifting slightly, as if bracing against a realization that was still forming but already unavoidable. "Then clarify it," she said, her voice steady, though softer now, less commanding, more precise, as though she were choosing each word with greater care than before. Marcus met her gaze fully, without hesitation, the calm in his expression unchanged, but now carrying something more defined, something that no longer needed to be revealed in stages. "I hold the company," he said. The words were simple, almost understated, but they carried a finality that settled into the room like a door closing quietly but completely. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence that followed was not uncertain. It was absolute, built not on assumption or confusion, but on recognition. The chief financial officer lowered his eyes briefly, as if acknowledging the statement internally before lifting them again. The senior partner leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, the tension in his posture releasing into something closer to acceptance. Evelyn did not respond immediately. Her gaze remained on Marcus, steady, searching, but the certainty that had defined her earlier had shifted, replaced by something more complex, something that required adjustment rather than assertion. The city beyond the glass continued its distant motion, unchanged, unaware, while inside, the air felt still, grounded, as if the room itself had settled into a new alignment. Marcus did not move toward the chair, did not reclaim it physically, because he did not need to. The space had already changed. The meaning of it had already shifted. And everyone in the room understood that, even before a single person spoke again. The words did not echo, they settled, final and unmoving. And for a moment, the entire room seemed to forget how to function, as if every instinct built on hierarchy and assumption had been quietly disconnected. Marcus did not shift his stance after speaking. He did not step forward, did not reach for the chair, did not reinforce his statement with anything more than his presence, because he understood that the truth, once recognized, did not need repetition. Across the table, Evelyn Whitmore remained still, her gaze fixed on him, but something in it had changed, something subtle but undeniable, the difference between looking at someone and truly seeing them. The confidence that had once moved effortlessly through her posture now moved more carefully, recalibrating, adjusting to a reality that no longer aligned with the structure she had relied on. The chief financial officer cleared his throat again, this time not out of uncertainty, but out of necessity, as though silence had reached its limit and something had to give. All controlling shares, he said, his voice measured, precise, are now registered under Marcus Reed. He paused briefly, glancing down at the tablet before lifting his eyes again. Effective as of 9:42 p.m. last night. The timestamp landed with quiet precision, anchoring the moment in something undeniable, something recorded, something permanent. A faint shift moved through the board members, chairs adjusting by inches, shoulders straightening, eyes redirecting, not dramatically, but enough to signal alignment, enough to acknowledge that the center of authority had already changed before any of them walked into the room. The senior partner leaned back fully now, exhaling slowly, his earlier tension dissolving into a calm acceptance that carried its own weight. Then the meeting proceeds under new leadership, he said, not asking, not suggesting, but stating, his voice steady, his tone neutral, yet decisive. No one objected. No one questioned it. Evelyn's fingers rested lightly on the table now, no longer gripping, no longer anchoring herself through control of the space. She looked down briefly at the documents in front of her, the same papers she had arranged with such precision only minutes earlier, and for the first time, they seemed disconnected from her, like tools that no longer responded the same way. When she looked back up at Marcus, the pause before her next movement was longer, more deliberate, as if she were choosing not just her words, but her position within a structure that had shifted beneath her. Slowly, without ceremony, she rose from the chair. The movement was controlled, composed, but it carried a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken. The soft sound of the chair moving back across the polished floor was the only noise in the room, and it lingered just long enough to mark the transition. No one rushed to fill the space. No one interrupted the moment. Marcus watched without expression, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with a calm understanding of what had just occurred. Evelyn stepped to the side, her posture still upright, her presence still strong, but no longer occupying the center by assumption. The space at the head of the table was now open, not claimed, not forced, simply available. The assistant near the door shifted her weight slightly, her eyes moving from Evelyn to Marcus, then back again, as if witnessing a moment she would later describe in a single sentence that would never fully capture its weight. The chief financial officer adjusted his position, turning slightly toward Marcus, ready, attentive, no longer divided in focus. The senior partner folded his hands loosely on the table, his attention steady, aligned. The room had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Marcus took a step forward then, not rushed, not hesitant, simply moving into the space that had been cleared, his shoes making the faintest sound against the floor, grounding the moment in something real, something physical. He did not look around for permission. He did not wait for acknowledgement. He reached the chair and paused for just a second, his hand resting lightly on the back, the leather cool beneath his fingers, the same chair he had been told to leave only moments earlier. The contrast did not need to be spoken. It existed in the silence, in the memory still fresh in every mind in the room. Then, with the same calm that had carried him through every moment before, Marcus sat down. The movement was simple, unforced, but it carried a finality that settled deeper than any words could have. No one spoke. No one needed to. The meeting had not just changed direction. It had changed truth. Marcus did not adjust the chair after sitting, did not lean back to claim comfort or lean forward to assert pressure. He simply settled into stillness, his posture aligned, his presence centered, as if the room had always been arranged this way and everyone else was only now catching up to it. The faint reflection of his silhouette stretched across the glass wall behind him, merging with the skyline beyond, a quiet reminder that the world outside continued unchanged while everything inside had shifted. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of what had just occurred lingered in the air, not heavy, not oppressive, but undeniable, like a truth that had always existed but had only now been acknowledged. Evelyn Whitmore remained standing beside the chair she had vacated, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture still composed, but no longer anchored to the center of the room. Her gaze moved across the table, taking in the subtle changes that had unfolded in less than a minute. The way the chief financial officer now faced Marcus without hesitation, the way the senior partner's attention had fully redirected, the way the silence itself felt different, no longer waiting for her direction. She exhaled slowly, the movement small, controlled, but enough to signal a shift not just in position, but in understanding. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, not diminished, but measured in a different way, as though each word carried more weight now that it no longer rested on assumption alone. "Then we should proceed," she said, her tone steady, composed, but stripped of the earlier edge that had defined it. It was not an apology. It was not a concession. It was something more restrained, more deliberate, an acknowledgement without declaration. Marcus met her gaze briefly, not holding it long enough to challenge, not avoiding it either, simply recognizing it, then letting it pass as he turned his attention to the table. "We will," he replied, his voice even, calm, as if the transition required no further emphasis. He reached for the documents in front of him, not hurriedly, not as a performance, but with the same measured precision that had carried him through every moment before. His fingers brushed the edge of the top page, aligning it with the others, a small, almost unnoticed gesture that nonetheless carried a quiet authority. Around the table, the board members followed his movement without instruction, their attention aligning naturally, not out of habit this time, but out of recognition. The chief financial officer straightened slightly, ready, focused, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a clear sense of direction. The senior partner nodded once, subtle but definitive, as if confirming a decision already made internally. Evelyn remained where she was for a moment longer, observing, recalibrating, then slowly moved to a seat along the side of the table, not rushed, not hesitant, simply adjusting to the new structure that had taken shape. The soft sound of her chair sliding into place was almost lost in the stillness, but it marked a boundary, a line between what had been and what now was. Marcus glanced briefly at the screen mounted on the wall, then toward the assistant near the door. "Please bring up the updated projections," he said, his tone steady, clear, not raised, but carrying naturally across the room. The assistant nodded immediately, her hands moving quickly now, the earlier hesitation gone, replaced by a focused efficiency. The screen flickered to life, numbers and charts appearing in clean lines of light, reflecting softly across the glass and the polished table. Marcus looked at the data for a moment, not rushing into explanation, allowing the room to absorb the shift not just in authority, but in direction. "We will start with the acquisition impact," he said, his voice calm, grounded, guiding rather than commanding. The words settled easily, without resistance, because the room no longer needed to question who was speaking. Evelyn listened, her expression composed, but her gaze more attentive now, more precise, as if she were seeing the details in a way she had not before. There was no interruption, no attempt to reclaim the center, only a quiet adjustment, a recognition that leadership had not been taken by force, but revealed through clarity. The meeting moved forward, not with the same rhythm as before, but with a new one, steadier, more deliberate, shaped not by assumption, but by understanding. And in that shift, something deeper settled into place, something that did not need to be spoken, because it was already felt in every movement, every glance, every quiet moment that followed. The meeting did not end with a declaration. It did not close with applause or final statements. It simply continued until there was nothing left to question, and then, almost quietly, it dissolved into movement, chairs shifting back, documents being gathered, screens dimming as one by one the board members stood and adjusted to the new reality that no longer needed explanation. Marcus remained seated for a moment longer after the last point had been addressed, his hands resting lightly on the table, the faint reflection of the city stretching across the polished surface beneath them, steady and unchanged. Around him, the room slowly emptied, not in a rush, but with a measured pace, as if each person needed a few extra seconds to recalibrate before stepping back into the world outside. The chief financial officer approached first, not hurried, not hesitant, but deliberate, his posture respectful in a way that had not been present at the beginning. "Everything will be updated by end of day," he said, his voice clear, professional, but carrying a tone that acknowledged more than just a task. Marcus nodded once, a small, simple gesture that required no elaboration. The senior partner followed with a brief exchange, a few quiet words about next steps, his tone aligned, his attention steady, no longer divided between uncertainty and expectation. Each interaction was efficient, grounded, absent of unnecessary formality, as if the structure had already reset itself internally. Evelyn Whitmore did not approach immediately. She remained near the side of the table where she had been seated, her hands resting lightly against the back of her chair, her gaze lowered for a moment, as if considering something that extended beyond the room, beyond the meeting, something that required more than a quick adjustment. When she finally moved, it was with the same composure she had carried from the beginning, but tempered now, refined, as though sharpened by clarity rather than assumption. She stepped toward Marcus, stopping at a distance that felt intentional, neither too close nor too removed, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not tense. It was steady, grounded, carrying the weight of everything that had already been said without needing repetition. "I misjudged the situation," she said at last, her voice calm, direct, without hesitation, the words offered without embellishment or defense. It was not an apology shaped for comfort. It was a statement of fact, precise and controlled. Marcus looked at her, his expression unchanged, not distant, not cold, simply present. He did not respond immediately. He let the words settle, acknowledging them not through reaction, but through attention. "Situations change," he said after a moment, his tone even, measured, offering neither validation nor rejection, only perspective. Evelyn held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a slight nod, a quiet acknowledgement that did not require further explanation. There was no extended exchange, no attempt to revisit what had already passed. She turned then, gathering her things with the same precision as before, but without the earlier need to control the space around her. The room continued to clear, the assistant powering down the screen, the faint glow fading from the glass as the last of the data disappeared. Marcus rose from his chair, not to assert anything further, but simply because the moment had reached its natural end. He placed one hand briefly on the back of the chair, the leather cool beneath his fingers, then stepped away, moving toward the glass wall at the far end of the room. Outside, the city stretched in every direction, buildings rising and falling in measured lines, traffic flowing steadily below, the late afternoon light casting long reflections across the windows. He stood there for a moment, not thinking in words, not replaying the meeting, just observing, breathing, allowing the stillness to settle in after the shift that had just taken place. Behind him, the door opened and closed softly as the last person left, the sound barely audible, but enough to mark the transition from a room full of voices to a space defined by quiet. Marcus turned slightly, his gaze moving once more across the table, now empty. The chairs pushed back just enough to show where people had been sitting, the documents neatly stacked, the air still carrying the faint trace of conversation that had already faded. Nothing in the room announced what had happened. There was no sign, no visible marker. And yet, everything had changed. The chair at the head of the table remained where it was, still, unremarkable, but no longer just a seat. It held the memory of a moment, of a shift, of a truth revealed without force. Marcus walked past it without stopping, his steps quiet against the floor, his reflection moving with him across the glass. The light continued to shift as the sun lowered, casting a softer glow across the room, settling into the space like a final breath. No words followed. None were needed. The silence carried everything.